Watch these unseen slavery struggles and untold strength in historical pictures that will make your stomach turn. After the Civil War in 1865, what did it mean for black mothers to bring up their children in an atmosphere that sought to tear families apart? This image of a black mother breastfeeding her baby depicts a powerful example of resilience during slavery. In the 1980s, how does the history of slavery continue to influence present jail time? This image of numerous people standing together reflects the interaction between private prisons and the past of the slave trade, which profited from the confinement of individuals. A slave caught in a net to be sold in the People's Republic of Congo. A terrible way to treat people, but at this time, it was normal. How do the steps taken under the Flora and Fauna Act of 1836 affect how those who are marginalized are treated today? This image of an Australian native standing while chained black men sit exemplifies the dehumanization of both Indigenous and black people. The 1836 Flora and Fauna Act, which labeled Indigenous Australians as flora and fauna, is a vivid reminder of systematic racism and submission. This photograph depicts individuals sprinting while water is sprayed behind them, a common practice during the 1963 Civil Rights Movement. Officers brutally dispersed demonstrators using water cannons, signifying the harsh opposition to black Americans' demand for equal privileges. The Atlantic slave trade was likely the most costly in human life of all long-distance global migrations. It's terrible to see the fear in their eyes, locked up like animals. What does this image reveal about the oppressive conditions in India under British colonial rule? The image of a woman carrying a British merchant on her back in West Bengal in 1903 represents the labor abuse experienced by colonized peoples. It illustrates the enormous obligations imposed on individuals during British rule, when native communities were frequently pressured into loyalty and hard labor for the advantage of colonial powers. In most institutions of slavery throughout the world, the children of slaves became the property of the owner. This created a constant supply of people to perform labor. What does this image reveal about the relationship between former slaves and their former masters after slavery was abolished? This portrait of Mrs. Amos Davis with a former slave exemplifies the complex post-1865 relationships between former slaves and their masters, in which power dynamics frequently lingered long after slavery was abolished. Congolese slaves were often punished by the private army of King Leopold II by chopping off their hands. What does this photograph show about the atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade in 1868? This photograph, taken aboard a British ship in 1868, depicts children who were saved just before being sold into slavery. It emphasizes the severity of the transatlantic slave trade, which put innocent lives at risk of exploitation and neglect. Here you see a human zoo, also known as ethnological expositions. These were public displays of people, usually in a so-called natural or primitive state. They were most prominent during the 19th and 20th centuries. What does this image reveal about racial power dynamics during slavery? The sight of a white guy sitting in a hammock while black men carry him exemplifies the tremendous racial power dynamics of slavery. It represents the forced slavery and dehumanization of black people, who were frequently forced to serve their oppressors in demeaning ways. An image depicting the harsh reality of wet nurses, showing two women, one black and one white, with two children. The artwork depicts racial and socioeconomic inequalities among wet nurses in the 19th century, with a black and white lady nursing children, emphasizing the exploitation of black women at the period. An image of a slave auction in Virginia, showing enslaved individuals being sold at a market. The graphic depicts a sad scene from a slave auction in Virginia, when enslaved people are auctioned, emphasizing the horrific realities of the transatlantic slave trade. It depicts the dehumanization and exploitation of African Americans in the 19th century. An insight into the lives of enslaved children in the United States, some of whom were forced to toil in fields alongside their mothers when they were just toddlers. An image from the 19th century showing two African American babies standing on each side of an elderly black man. The photograph depicts a touching scene from the 19th century, including two African American babies standing alongside an elderly black man. It symbolizes African American families' generational fortitude and endurance throughout a period of adversity and injustice. A 19th century photograph of ex-slave Thomas Lewis Johnson. The painting depicts Thomas Lewis Johnson, a former slave, illustrating the endurance and tenacity of ex-slaves in the post-Civil War era. It reflects both his personal journey and the larger struggle for liberty and equality. A photo of Wilson Chin, a branded slave from Louisiana. The photograph shows Wilson Chin, a former slave from Louisiana who was branded as punishment. It highlights the brutal and dehumanizing practices of slavery in the South, marking the painful legacy of physical and psychological scars left on enslaved individuals. This photograph depicts adolescent Southern chain gang inmates working in the fields. The photograph depicts young African-American inmates on a Southern chain gang being forced to work in the field. It illustrates the exploitation and severe labor circumstances that African Americans suffered under the convict leasing system, even after slavery was abolished. An illustration illustrating the punishment of a boy slave in Zanzibar. The image depicts the cruel whipping of a young enslaved kid in Zanzibar, emphasizing the brutal treatment of slaves in the area. It depicts the horror of slavery and the anguish that children face under such tyrannical institutions. What does this image say about the power of solidarity in overcoming system barriers? This image of Black people assisting one another upstairs represents strength, unity, and determination in the face of tragedy. It represents the collective struggle for freedom and justice as individuals help one another overcome obstacles, similar to the current fight for civil equal treatment. Slaves were used for the most ridiculous and degrading tasks. Here you see a heartless, rich white lady in a litter being carried by her slaves in Brazil, 1860. The heartbreaking picture of African slaves being sold at auction highlights the inhumanity of the transatlantic slave trade. The graphic represents a harrowing scene from the transatlantic slave trade, in which African captives are sold at auction. It exposes the dehumanization, separation of families, and the enormous agony faced by those. An intense image of a white guy forcing a black slave, representing the harshness of slavery. This artwork illustrates the severe power dynamics of slavery. The white man forcing a black slave, evoking the violence and exploitation that happened from the 17th to the 19th century. Enslaved African Americans were subjected to physical brutality, dehumanization, and forced labor, mainly in the southern United States, from the early 1600s until slavery was abolished in 1865. The scene is a vivid reminder of the cruelty and institutional prejudice that shaped slavery in America. Congolese slaves were often punished by the private army of King Leopold II by chopping off their hands. An illustration of two black ladies with ropes around their necks and chains around their hands, looking genuinely unhappy, symbolizing slavery's harshness. The photograph shows two enslaved black women from the 18th or 19th century, shackled with ropes and chains, emphasizing the terrible treatment and dehumanization of African women. This image depicts the terrible realities of slavery in the American South and other regions before its abolition in 1865. How does this image depict the courage and resilience of women in difficult situations? This image of a woman carrying a baby wrapped in cotton on her back represents the power and endurance of mothers. It highlights the critical role that women have had in nurturing and safeguarding their children, often in tough and oppressive circumstances, while preserving their dignity and survival. J. Marion Sims, dubbed the father of modern gynecology, bought enslaved black women and subjected them to risky medical experiments. He frequently performed genital procedures on these women without anesthesia, stating that black women did not experience pain. This immoral practice emphasizes the exploitation and dehumanization of African American women in the 19th century. An photograph of inmates in chains in Zanzibar highlights the terrible treatment of enslaved people. The image depicts inmates in chains in Zanzibar during the 19th century, highlighting the brutal conditions of enslavement and forced labor in East Africa. This scenario highlights the terrible methods of slavery and exploitation of Africans, particularly at Zanzibar, which was an important hub in the transatlantic and Indian Ocean slave trades at the time. An illustration of black women holding shovels, representing forced labor and exploitation. This image depicts black women with shovels, most likely working in fields or labor camps around the 19th century. It depicts the brutal realities of forced labor experienced by African American women during slavery, when they were subjected to arduous physical labor with little to no rights or freedoms. The picture emphasizes the exploitation and tenacity of black women throughout this sad moment in history. Slaves were sold for local goods, including cotton, rum, sugar, dyes, and logwood. These goods would then be transported back to Europe for sale. A child of a slave who is taken while his parents are working. Fortunately, he didn't see the seriousness of the matter at the moment. While his parents spent hours picking cotton, he played in the harvest, an image of convict leasing victims that depicts the exploitation of African Americans in post-Civil War America. The graphic represents victims of the convict leasing system, which saw African Americans captured and forced into labor following the Civil War. This practice, which began in the late 1800s, allowed states to lease out inmates, primarily black males, to work in mines, farms, and factories under harsh conditions. It emphasizes the persistence of exploitation and racial inequality in the South even after slavery was abolished. A photograph of a Georgia chain gang depicts African American inmates being forced to work in severe conditions. The photograph shows a Georgia chain gang where African American inmates were chained together and forced to work in harsh conditions during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This practice, part of the convict leasing program, continued to exploit black people in the South even after slavery was abolished, exacerbating racial inequality and injustice. An image of slave plantation art prints for sale, highlighting the commodification of slavery. The image exhibits slave plantation-related art prints, which were frequently sold for profit in the 19th century. These prints, which were sometimes romanticized or depicted daily life on plantations, were part of a larger market that commercialized the lives and labor of enslaved people. They serve as a reminder of how slavery permeated the South's economy and culture, impacting art and commerce. A disturbing picture depicts a black woman breastfeeding both a white and a black infant, illustrating the exploitation of black women as wet nurses. The artwork shows a black woman breastfeeding both a white and a black infant, representing the exploitation of black women throughout slavery and the post-slavery era. Black women were frequently forced to work as wet nurses, removed from their own children to care for white families' youngsters, underlying racial and social inequities at the time. The image of a young child from the tribe of Judah plucking cotton represents the forced labor and exploitation of black children under slavery. Despite their innocence, they were forced to perform arduous tasks for people who tormented and oppressed them. A powerful image of three black men standing with enormous weights on their backs, representing the weight of slavery and the struggle for freedom. The painting depicts three black males bearing enormous weights, symbolizing the immense physical and emotional strain of slavery. Their stance and the weight they bear provide a vivid vision of the oppression faced by enslaved people. This moment also exemplifies the resilience and struggle for liberation in the fight against slavery. Sarah and Angelina Grimke, two sisters born into a wealthy slave-owning family in South Carolina, became fervent abolitionists around the turn of the 19th century. Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who were born into a slave-owning family in South Carolina, witnessed the harsh realities of slavery as children. About 60 years before the Civil War, they bucked their Southern background to become outspoken abolitionists and women's rights supporters. Their activity was essential in confronting the institution of slavery and pushing for social justice in the 19th century. A heartbreaking photograph of a young girl with her enslaved servant in the Brazilian Empire, 1880, depicts the reality of slavery soon before it was abolished. This image from the Brazilian Empire in 1880 depicts a young girl and her enslaved servant, highlighting the country's long-standing slavery issue. The photograph depicts the dramatic contrast between the lives of the rich and the slaves, taken just 5 years before Brazil became the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888. A disturbing image of a white man using a hunter's whip on a black man, his body marked, a newly enslaved individual. The artwork depicts a white guy using a whip on a black man, whose body is marked, implying that he is a freshly enslaved human. This horrible scenario exemplifies the cruel and dehumanizing methods used to manage and punish enslaved individuals. It depicts the harsh realities of slavery, when physical torture was frequent, especially in the southern United States during the 18th and 19th centuries. A heartbreaking photograph of an elderly black guy with tears in his eyes, indicating the profound emotional toll of a lifetime of suffering. This stunning image depicts an elderly black guy with tears in his eyes, evoking the emotional pain and grief of a life marked by adversity and possibly enslavement. His expression exemplifies the ongoing trauma and suffering experienced by many black people, particularly those who lived through slavery and its consequences. An African-American woman called a nursemaid is holding Oscan Menard in Louisiana around 1850. These nursemaids were the ones that were threated the worst, but had the most influence on the children and their upbringing. Over the period of the Atlantic slave trade, from approximately 1526 to 1867, some 12.5 million captured men, women, and children were put on ships in Africa, and 10.7 million arrived in the Americas. This was the case with, for example, thralls and American slaves. In other cases, children were enslaved as if they were adults, how they were being sold. On the left, an announcement of a public auction for the sale of 440 slaves. In the center, an offer to purchase slaves at a price ranging from $1,200 to $1,250 each. And on the right, wanted notice offering a $400 bounty for the capture, dead or alive, of a slave named George. As we journey through these haunting images of the past, we are faced with the raw reality of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and resilience. These photographs are more than just history. They are voices echoing the stories of those who were silenced, reminding us of the weight of injustice and the strength of survival. In a world where so many were stripped of their dignity, we are reminded of the importance of standing together today to honor their pain, their endurance, and their hope for a future they might not have lived to see. These stories are not just lessons of what was, but calls to action for what can be. We are fortunate to live in a time where the fight for equality and justice continues to gain strength, but the battle is not over. Nobody, absolutely nobody, deserves to endure the suffering or indignity that these images reflect. They demand that we never forget and that we commit ourselves to a world where such horrors can never take root again. Let us not turn away, but face these truths, not with despair, but with determination. Together, we can build a future where humanity's greatest legacy is one of compassion, understanding, and love. May it inspire us all to be the change we wish to see for them, for us, and for the generations yet to come.